Welcome to Ideagen TV. We're excited to have with us Paula Tavares, Senior Legal and Gender Specialist at the World Bank. Paula from Brazil, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
So great to have you on Ideagen TV today, Paula, especially with the role you play at the World Bank. It's profound. And you and your insights and most importantly, your leadership over the years has been exemplary, impactful, insightful. And as we like to say to just about everyone that interviews on Ideagen TV, one of the factors in these interviews is being able to peer or see around corners, to see what's coming at us, to effectively develop and implement partnerships, innovation, etc. Paula, could you tell us a little bit about yourself as well as your role and responsibilities as Senior Legal and Gender Specialist at the World Bank?
Thank you. Yes, so it's, again, like I said, it's an honor to be here with you today, and we've been kind of having this collaboration for a couple of years now, and I think, you know, the purpose of our work aligns. I'm a Senior Legal Specialist and Gender Specialist at the World Bank. I've been at the World Bank since 2010, so about 10 years, a little bit over that, and really working on advancing women's rights and gender equality around the world. I'm originally from Brazil, so I'm a lawyer from Brazil, and the legal background led me into human rights and development, but focusing more on the policy side and understanding that policy making is critical to shaping the lives of individuals around the world. So that has been a big part of my work. The focus of the work has been initially through research at the World Bank. The project that I have been focusing on, one of the flagship initiatives at the World Bank, focusing on gender equality and women's empowerment, the Women, Business, and the Law, is an annual report that looks at the impact of laws on women's participation in the economy in 190 countries around the world. And we've been doing this for about 10 years. And so part of the work has been really looking at where women's rights and men's rights are still not equal. And we have most countries where there is still at least one inequality in the law. But also looking at where progress is happening and how it's happening and helping advance that progress. So that's been the focus of my work at the World Bank for all these years, also looking at gender-based violence, and then specifically some regional kind of focus in Africa, Latin America, and Brazil, where I'm from.
You know, Paula, that's incredible to hear from you, especially with your success in your role at the World Bank. And wondering for our global audience, where did your inspiration and passion come from to work toward this focus on gender equality and the empowerment of women?
So I thought of that as well a while ago, because I didn't necessarily study gender issues or women's issues. It is a common topic now, but it wasn't back then. So my focus was more human rights, but I did go into this work very passionately and looking at it from the perspective of, you know, women's rights are human rights and the policy making component. But I stopped to think about it, and I come from a family of very empowered women. Both my grandmothers worked in their times, and on my father's side, my grandmother was a dentist back in her time, which was not common, especially in Brazil. And on my mother's side as well, she worked in a law office. My parents have both always been very gender equal, bringing up children, and we're three girls, we're two sisters. And even with that, I realized that even in this ideal environment that I feel like I was kind of privileged to be brought into, there were social and cultural constraints. And I did make some decisions along my career because of some of these issues, which I didn't even realize at the time. For example, I thought of going into the foreign affairs world and being a diplomat, and I realized that's probably hard to do and have the family at the same time. And I realized that that's not a thought that a man would have necessarily when considering a career. So I realized that, you know, there's still a lot of differences. I also had a lot of international exposure growing up, with living in different countries with my parents and my family, moving around a little bit. And I realized that realities are also very different around the world, and especially for women. And so this passion that I've always had for justice and the guarantee of rights and human rights kind of translated into doing this work. And when I started having this opportunity to specifically work on this and advance rights for women and equality in general, this really became something that I'm very passionate about and have been over the years.
What incredible impact, Paula. And, you know, you've obviously made such an incredible impact, as we talked about, and interesting to hear how you've arrived, how it's all sort of evolved in terms of this focus and passion for the work that you do each and every day. In January of 2020, we were at a much different point in time. We had just entered, you know, this new decade, and we were looking at the runway to 2030 and achieving these global goals that were obviously unanimously agreed to by the 193 member states of the UN. You being a big proponent, based on the work that you do, for achieving these goals. Paula, what would you say, and what have you seen to be a dramatic change in gender equality now, as opposed to when you first started your career? And I'd like to go a step further to say, how has this time with the pandemic either accelerated and or highlighted the work toward achieving gender equality?
Thank you. And yes, I mean, I think we are definitely at a different kind of moment now with everything that's happened this year. January was definitely a different scenario, but I'll talk about up to that point for now, because I think part of it is the progress that we've achieved so far. And I think there's been huge and dramatic change in both the understanding and the visibility around the issues, the prioritization and the focus, both from government side, but also organizations, the private sector especially. And I've seen this even within the World Bank. When I started, of course, this work was starting, and there was already the focus on gender equality as part of, you know, the one of the key components of achieving the World Bank's mission of eradicating extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. But it was a little bit later on with the 2012 World Development Report that focused specifically on gender. And beyond that, the understanding growing that really this is a key issue for sustainable growth, for sustainable development, to advancing not just the World Bank goals, but also country goals in economic development and economic growth. So I think we've seen a great change just in the understanding and the visibility. And I think also around the world, we've seen many things develop since, with the Sustainable Development Goals and goal number 5, for example, the Me Too movement afterwards, and just a lot of global movements that have been focusing on some of these issues and prioritizing them. Our work has been very closely connected to this, which is advancing gender equal laws. So even from when I started, we've seen huge change. We did a historical analysis back in 2018 and looking at the implementation, for example, of domestic violence laws. And we saw that, you know, there are very little, couple of laws in the early 1990s. It wasn't an issue that was globally recognized as something that should be legislated and that women should be protected against. And now we have over 150 countries with these laws, and the number keeps going up every year. And a large part of this is because of the work and the visibility that the World Bank has been giving it with the measurement and the data, but also other organizations, of course, the UN, UN Women, many others that focus on these issues. But I feel like I've been a part of this movement in advancing some of these laws. And if we look back even 50 years, which is an even longer time frame, and this was also research that was done by the Women, Business, and the Law recently, we found, that 1,500 reforms were implemented across the last 50 years, right, in the 190 economies, and most of them in sub-Saharan Africa and even throughout Europe. And so I feel like the data has become a lot better, which helps us understand where the gaps are, what the issues are. A lot of the work that I've been doing as well, which is supporting civil society in their work, advocating for better laws and better rights for women, but also supporting governments, which is part of the work that I'm also focusing on now, which is a new program with the World Bank, which is taking the research of the Women, Business, and the Law team and helping governments implement these changes in their legislation. So all of this really helps push the needle, and I think we've seen a lot of good progress.
Well, Paula, you've described a lot of incredible progress and dramatic changes in gender equality that you've experienced, led, participated in, et cetera. And so in working so closely with gender equality, what do you believe is the biggest inhibitor in achieving Goal 5 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is gender equality, and why?
So, I think there are a lot of factors that we could look at. Current factors, what are the barriers still today? But the way I look at it is, discrimination and inequality is still very much ingrained in society, historically, in different cultures around the world. And this is not specific regions or countries, this is globally. We know that these discriminations against women, the inequality even in the law, were everywhere, right? Even 50 years back, and that's part of the research that we do. We know that it wasn't until the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination, of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW, not long ago, about 50 years ago, that we had a first international convention looking at these inequalities and understanding that women do have and should have equal rights to men, and that these should be protected by governments, and that discrimination should not be allowed. And that's when things started changing very slowly. But I feel like, a lot of the restrictions that we saw in the laws and still do in many countries, they're still in practice. It takes a bit more time to change, right? And so what we see is, even changing the law doesn't necessarily change the practice or what's happening. And so we still have, for example, women as the primary members of the household responsible for caring for children, which reduces their time for work, for example. We still see that gender-based violence and violence against women, for example, which was allowed by law in many countries in the past, is still a practice that is common and that still stops women from being fully empowered and achieving their full potential. We know this year, for example, we're just celebrating the 100th anniversary of suffrage and women's right to vote in the United States. And that took 72 years to achieve from when the movement started with Seneca Falls. And so a lot of this, we just realized, takes time, right? And that's been the message that we've been giving, is that, we are making progress, but the progress is still slow, right? And so if we keep going in the same pace, it will be hard to achieve Goal 5, for example, and all the others, which, gender is a cross-cutting issue for all the other SDG goals by 2030. And so really, I feel like there needs to be a lot more prioritization from governments, from civil society, from everyone to move this faster.
Incredible. And so in working towards the gender equality, what are some projects that the World Bank is also working on, including perhaps economic growth?
So again, like I said, the gender equality is a core element, and achieving gender equality is a core element of the World Bank's work now. So gender is a cross-cutting component of the World Bank work, right? So every thematic area that we work on, whether it's, education, health, transportation, water, sanitation, climate change, all of this has to have somewhat of a gender lens, and understanding what could be the implications for women, and how can the World Bank's work and projects and operations help advance gender equality and improve women's economic empowerment, right? So within the World Bank work and its focus on economic growth for countries, the element and the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment is very central to the work everywhere around the world. But it's also becoming, and it has been for quite some time, also a key element of the research that is being done, and understanding that countries are losing a lot of economic growth and just basically financial benefits just by not having gender equality. So we have, for example, the McKinsey report a few years back that mentioned 28 trillion could be added to the global economy by equalizing or advancing women's participation in the workforce. The World Bank has recently done some analysis looking at human capital wealth and the impacts to that and the losses to countries, which amount to 172 billion, if I'm not mistaken, in human capital wealth around the world due to gender inequalities, right? And so understanding that really it's a central issue for countries in boosting competitiveness, in boosting private sector growth and economic development. And that's a lot of the approach that the World Bank has been doing within its work as well.
Well, and those are very, deep insights into the work of the World Bank. And so, Paula, with the current global situation, what sort of setbacks have you seen toward achieving, especially Goal 8, decent work and economic growth of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And what do you think is the best strategy to get us back on track or to accelerate this goal?
Yeah. So that's coming to now, and with COVID and post-COVID. And I think a lot of the analysis is still being done in terms of the impacts, but we already have a very clear, I think, picture and understanding that setbacks are already happening and unfortunately are projected to happen, right? Unless we do take action. And I think action is needed, and countries are, right? But when we think, for example, of the unemployment rates around the world, we knew that about 172 million people worldwide in 2018 were unemployed. This number has already grown with COVID. So we have projections of increased unemployment rates, also of just kind of extreme and moderate poverty, but extreme poverty, an increase from the 700 million workers who lived in extreme or moderate poverty in 2018. Especially when you think about women's participation in the labor force and in informal employment, especially, this has also was already unequal before. We weren't already at equality. It was about 48% in 2018, compared with 75% for men, and this has already decreased for women, right? So women have been most affected by the economic crisis, by the impacts of basically having to stay home and working from home, with losing more jobs, with more vulnerable employment, with the fact that they work more in the types of employment that have suffered and experienced greater layoffs because of the type of work that they do, which is more on the retail side, on the services side, versus the types of work that men do, which for the most part, or to at least more so, can be done remotely or from home. The other issue, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is the fact that with staying home and with children staying home, and with this still on the kind of medium-term horizon, women are the ones who are having increased responsibilities at home, caring for children, which has also reduced their time availability to both work, so to have productive employment, but also to look for employment if they're unemployed and if they can't work, and the type of work that they can do also being less prone to to remote work. So we are going to see, we are seeing already an increase in the vulnerability for everybody. We're seeing this around the world. So in terms of decent work and economic growth, we are already seeing the projections of setbacks and the actual figures for the few months already into the crisis. But women are more so affected by this and will be. And so part of what we've been saying is making sure that social protection schemes and that unemployment protections and government policies and measures, as they're adopted, make sure that they are prioritizing women, or at least making sure that women are covered in a way that they can be protected equally to men. And this might be, advancing flexible work and making sure that women can work from home, because that's been the issue for them, and caring for children so that childcare is available, or so that there's some support for this unpaid care work that women do, and making sure that women can be prioritized in government programs as needed to make sure, especially when they're single mothers, that they can provide for their families and provide for themselves in this time of crisis.
So Paula, you've outlined the spotlight that has shown even more brightly on these areas and these disparities, especially as it pertains to the economic empowerment of women across the planet. And so what do you see as opportunities for the World Bank? You've described a few, for the World Bank to help with this key piece. You're advocating, you're helping to lead, you're infusing that into your discussion. What other areas do you see the World Bank leading on with your, unique, very unique vantage point?
So, I think here, if going back to kind of the work that we do, I was just thinking that, part of the work that we do in advancing laws is precisely to support women's participation in the labor force, right? And that's a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the impacts of the crisis, and also making sure that unpaid care work, which is one of the key barriers identified for women's participation in the economy, can be equally distributed or does not overburden women so that they are disadvantaged in participation in the workforce. The other big component of that is, of course, gender-based violence and violence against women. Those have been the two key components that have been highlighted both during the crisis and COVID, but also as key barriers to women's equal and full participation. And then what I'll mention is just something that happened very recently, which is the direct product, not only of our work, but we were also very much involved in the UAE, which has just adopted very, very progressive laws advancing women's equality and women's rights. In particular, for example, the first country in the Middle East to adopt parental leave, which is a type of shared leave for mothers and fathers, which really has the goal of kind of distributing or encouraging shared responsibility for caring for children, especially once they're born and in the first few years. And so this is, a key highlight. We've been working on these, on the implementation and the adoption of these laws around the world. But this is just a very recent one, which was adopted, maybe 10 days ago, which, I'm very proud to report. But I think it's, this kind of work. If thinking about how the work that we do in advancing legislation and gender equal legislation, understanding that this really has an impact for women's participation in the workforce, right? And ensuring that women have equal access and that they can be supported in participating in the labor market.
Paula, that's absolutely incredible. Just to bring it all, together in terms of the theoretical, the practical, and the actual impact that's happening. It's in your world, it appears to be very linear. So you can see the problem, you can address it through the legal, advocacy that you're working on, and then you see the actual impact, as you just cited, with the work in the UAE. And so it has to be rewarding, especially since it was just 10 days ago. These are new developments, and always exciting to hear that. And so I think it's a perfect segue to leadership. Leadership is something we always talk about at Ideagen, because without leadership, you have no catalyst, you have no spark that can help to create the impact necessary to literally change the world. And so why do you believe that effective leadership combined with innovation are so crucial now more than ever?
So taking a gender lens perspective on this, I will mention that, and this has been all over the news, right? Just mentioning that, female leadership during the crisis has been shown to be quite effective and quite powerful in managing the crisis. And so I think that's one angle of it, and understanding that an approach to leadership through also a diversity lens and women's leadership has a role to play, especially in times of crisis, right? So the elements that women bring, but also the elements of diversity that are important. When you're thinking about innovation, that's a key element, right? You need to be creative, you need to be forward thinking, you need to kind of see all the angles and understand all the constraints and all the potential problems. And so I feel like part of the effective leadership angle is having women's participation in leadership more active. And we still don't have that globally, right? I mean, if you think of political participation, it's about 25% representation of women. That's the Interparliamentary Union's assessment of leadership in political positions and government positions. That's also in the private sector, and the private sector has a big role to play as well. There's on one hand, you have government policies and measures that can be implemented, and that's is quite effective. But on the other hand, we have a private sector as a leading component of this, and we see a lot of private sector policies and practices and leadership that sometimes even drive government measures and policies to be implemented. So leadership that takes us in the right direction, that's inclusive, that's diverse, that understands that we should all be part of this, and that we kind of leaving no one behind, I think is crucial. And this also, the component is also, when you think of leadership also as role models for young boys and girls and young women and men who are now kind of growing up in this new scenario, and that will be their reality for a while. Seeing, role models that have effective leadership will also, help bring them and bring them up and show them a world where, this type of leadership is valuable and that they can aspire to be leaders in the same way.
Paula, incredible insights as always in your leadership role at the World Bank. What are 3 key pieces of advice, Paula, that you would provide our global audience to help achieve these 17 global goals by 2030?
So that's a hard one. I mean, I'll start, of course, with the gender equality component. UN Women has a great report that looks at how, women's empowerment, or goal 5, actually is a central and cross-cutting goal to all the other goals. So just understanding that you really can't achieve fully any of the other 16 goals if you don't achieve gender equality and if you don't empower women. And that means, focusing on ending gender-based violence, on making sure that women have a voice, that they can participate, that they are represented, that they're included, that they are in positions of leadership, and that they are in decision-making roles and can help drive the decisions that are made and the policies that are implemented. So as a key factor, right? When you think of education, health, and all the others. Similar to that is just making sure that we leave no one behind. And that's not just gender equality, but that's a broader inclusion aspect, right? I mean, it's just the understanding that unless we all advance and unless we leave no one behind, we won't be able to fully achieve the goals. And so it's looking at all the excluded groups, the minorities. We now have, you know, the anti-racism movement, which has grown exponentially as it should. And, you know, I draw a lot of parallels with the gender equality movement with, you know, the fact that, you know, the visibility is needed, the data is needed, so that we can also move the needle on some of these things. So it's inclusion in a broader sense. And then just understanding that everybody has to do their part, right? So it's you and I as individuals, it's you and I as, you know, who we represent or what we represent in terms of our professional roles and our organizations. It's government, it's civil society, it's the private sector, and understanding that unless we're all in this together, we won't get there.
Well said, as always. Paula Tavares, World Bank, what is your post-summit ask for our global audience as we continue to change the world together with you and the World Bank?
And advancing equality in the law for women and women's economic empowerment. A key element is understanding the data and the gaps, you know, looking at the research that the World Bank has been doing on this, the Women, Business, and the Law report, and the work on advancing both gender equality, but also development, the eradication of poverty. So visiting our website, looking at the data, implementing it in your work, and helping us all work together to advance changes for a better world tomorrow.
Paula Tavares, the World Bank, thank you for all you're doing to change the world. Thank you for your insights. And perhaps most importantly, thank you for your leadership. Thank you. It's an honor, and thank you for having me and for the excellent work that you do in advancing the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and bringing us all together to collaborate in this mission. Thank you, Paula.